Good morning, everyone. I've been asked to discuss two very interesting papers that deal with the role of migrants and social actors in the context of migration systems. Now, as a geographer, and as I guess by definition, an unreformed morphogeneticist, that's a hard word, I will probably develop a slightly different perspective. I mean, I've spent most of my time looking at migration as it evolves over space and time. I'm interested in spatial structures, and I get nervous when I don't know what kind of migration we're talking about. And I noticed yesterday in our discussions, we talked a lot about what a migration system was, but very little about what a migration was. Is that just assumed? I mean, I think we really need to know whether it's short distance, long term, short term, whatever, internal or international. Now, as I say, I'm not really the ideal person to discuss these papers because of that. And even more that I've spent most of my life outside Europe working on non-Western systems of mobility. So I think I'm sort of singularly unqualified to discuss them, but never mind. I think that's one of all of us our better jokes. Okay, but the first question I have, it's got methodological rather than theoretical, and applies to both papers, perhaps more directly to Cindy's. It's whether migration systems can really be examined from destination areas. Because quite clearly, destination areas represent just one part of diasporas, however we define them, relative to their place of origin. So can we really examine a system and how it evolves by looking at these destination communities? Are we likely to find the bold pioneer? I'll come back to that in a minute, because they may have gone back. But I was very pleased that she was looking at a marginal destination, because I think we can learn a lot from migration in and out of marginal destinations. And of course, I do come from one of these marginal origins and destinations. And I would like to have seen a little bit more possibly comparative work between Norway and some of the other parts of Europe which are marginal. But then Cindy came back to this critical point at the end. I didn't find it in her paper, but she mentioned it in an oral presentation, that these national divisions, the Ukraine, Brazil, or whatever, are far too large, really, to generate meaningful migration systems. Both authors emphasize the importance of time. That's quite clear. They were comfortable with time. Ewa talked about continuous becoming. I was a little wondering about what the nuances of continuously becoming actually meant. Why not just continuous change? But continuous becoming actually sounds quite nice. But the focus of constantly shifting migration is there, but why no mention of space, or very little mention of space? It will make a difference whether migrants are coming from Kiev or whether they come from an isolated village in the eastern Ukraine. It will make a big difference whether we're talking about migrants from the Berber regions of Morocco or whether we're coming from the plains areas. That's important, and we need to know that if we're going to look at the evolution of migration systems. Both papers examine critically, and I think correctly, the idea of pioneers, bridgeheaders, or gatekeepers in establishing the migration system. Now, the idea of the bold pioneer leaving the community of his, and it's usually his initially, when we're talking, it is gendered, on his own volition to seek his fortune elsewhere is examined. And I think that goes back many, many decades ago to what the great Canadian-American historian Bill McNeill talked about whimsically, the Dick Whittington syndrome of the bold pioneer leaving his or her village. In other words, leaving the family, exerting his independence from his or her parents. However, I too wonder if these people, with their dominant, innovative element to their agency, and that's a quotation from one of the papers, will be more oriented to cutting off ties with the community of origin. I didn't quite follow the logic there, because if I were an innovative entrepreneur, preserve me, and had left my community and I'm setting up a business, I would surely look back to the people I trusted in my home village to bring them down as labor to be exploited in the activity that I was establishing in a highly segmented urban labour market. Because let's make no mistake about this, when we're looking at internal migration to cities, we see that the urban labour markets are highly segmented. Migrants from particular areas tend to control particular activities. However, more to the point, how typical are the Dick Whittingtons as bold pioneers? Now, in my own work, I did look for Dick Whittingtons, trying to lead these little villages and then setting up putting in train the system, the followers to come behind. But I tended to find that these early migrants usually left because of a link with a bigger system. Key to the early migration, the two important issues, at least in the areas I looked at in southern Peru. First, the labor recruiter, the enganchador, the labor recruiter who came in, got many of the men drunk, and they found out the next morning they were indebted and had to work off that debt. Also the military recruiter. These were the ways that the migration began from so many of the communities I looked at, linking to a wider system. If we're going to look at the gender aspect, the early women who would leave, often it was done through fictive kin, compadrasco. Wealthy women in the cities contacting friends who are landlords. Do you know a girl in the village who can come to look after my daughter's children? That kind of thing. So linking to a broader system rather than a bold pioneer moving on his or her own volition from the village. That's what was driving this migration in the first place. Both authors are well aware, and I think from the discussions yesterday as well, we're bringing the importance of power into the analysis. But it's the agency of the powerful in creating these institutional networks that are important, that channel the migrants. And that I don't think is as clearly brought out. And here I'm not thinking just of migrants, because the agency of the powerful, some of these powerful people may not be migrants. They are people in the city who require labour and send out the recruiters. But I would like to have seen greater discussions in any discussion of agency. I'd like to see more emphasis on who have power and how that is differentiated by social group and location. Now, let me just take a couple of examples from the paper to show what I mean. Now, interestingly, Ewa skipped over in her oral presentation the example of the Hmong that, given my background, I did pick up. She was bringing out a very interesting point on aestheticism and the motivation of migration. And she was arguing, quoting from a 1986, which is quite early, 1986 discussion that Hmong in the United States were communicating with the Hmong in Vietnam that don't come to the plains of Minneapolis, they're awful. You don't want to be here. Now, I take that point because you cannot imagine two environments more different than the places of origin in the mountainous, subtropical humid forest of Vietnam and the continental climate flat plains of Minneapolis. But the key question is, why are the Hmong in Minneapolis? And the Hmong, as I think most of you know, are a minority group in Southeast Asia. And as a minority group, they've been fighting lowland powers for centuries, retreating into the mountain fastness in the face of the expansion of lowland groups, which in Vietnam were the Viet, or the King. And when the Americans became involved with the lowland powers and where the Cold War ran hot, in the Vietnam War, or the American War as the Vietnamese prefer to call it, they used the Hmong as very effective fighters in their battle against the Viet Cong. And after the defeat of the United States, they brought the Hmong to prevent them being, at best, re-educated and at worst, liquidated. So they're bringing them back to the United States from an altruistic point of view, in a way. But just why they went to Minneapolis is, I think, another bad joke. They could have looked for an environment that was closer to what they were used to. I mean, the interesting point is that, I take the importance of asceticism, but relative to the geopolitical factors behind this migration, I think it pales into insignificance. To throw out a couple of facts piece of data on this. In 1993, in 1993 Vietnam, which is 7 years after the Doi Moi reforms were initiated, we still saw vast differences in living standards between the isolated Hmong groups and the lowland Vietnamese. For example, 87% of the mountain ethnic groups in Vietnam at that time were deemed to live in absolute poverty. I'd just like to pick up on the highly mobile young people Ewa discusses towards the end of her paper, where actors are responding to up-to-the-minute labour market situations. She's absolutely correct in drawing attention to this increasing mobility, what she calls continuously redirected migration. Well, yes, up to a point. But much of this migration is not so much a floating population looking for work, but a search of companies for employees. Much of this migration, or mobility as I prefer to call it, is controlled through the movement of intra-corporate transferees. I'm working on a project in Hong Kong at the moment. It's about 24-25%, we think. Another part of this mobility is controlled by international headhunting firms. So in other words, there are very strict channels moving these people around. Even the floating populations of gap year students, seekers of life experience, are channeled into particular points in a global system. If you're looking at the global environmental movement, they are drawn to honeypots as they preserve the isolated landscapes. The last point I just want to touch on, and I think Cindy's going to develop it tomorrow, is marriage migration. Because marriage, even though more than half of fertility in Europe, I think, occurs outside marriage, marriage is still a very important institution. And I take the point that here we've got a boy or girl leaves a country, goes to another one, falls in love, and then brings somebody back. But in fact, there are important channels in marriage migration, particularly in Asia, where we see the international marriage migration, the brokers moving girls from southern Vietnam into Korea, from the Philippines and Thailand into Japan, and so on. So this is also a highly structured situation. Now, these three examples are given of different migration systems that differ by their participants, their sizes, and their directions and durations. While it is interesting and insightful to see what the participants think they are doing, it seems to me that we need to prioritize institutional factors in a temporal and spatial framework. And I want to do it in the last few minutes, just draw a parallel. Now, parallels are always dangerous because they are exactly that. They're not the same, but they're parallel. And that is in warfare. And I'm reading at the moment the very moving book by Max Arthur, Forgotten Voices of the Great War, which I think builds on books such as The Beauty and the Sorrow by the great Swedish historian Peter Englund, looking at the soldier, how they see it, how they react, the extraordinary stories of courage and resilience in quite extraordinary situations that give us an insight into the tragedy that is the human condition. Now, they don't tell us much about why the war was occurring, because the soldiers in many ways do not know. The fighting man had little understanding, not just of the actual battle in which he was involved at the moment, but of the broader causes of the conflict itself. For that, we need to go to other sources in the archives, primarily if it's the First World War. If it's the Vietnam War, we can talk to some of the participants, those who had agency in directing what ultimately was a meaningless conflict. Today, we have to rely so much on our memoirs. I think this comes to Thomas's point of separating out systems and agency. In a way, they are two different things. What the stories of soldiers are telling us, stories of migrants are telling us, is very different, gives us a different insight relative to what the account would be of the creation of these channels of migration, channels towards conflict. So much of migration research recently has been migrant-centered. I think that this migration systems approach is in some way, following Hein's idea of the pendulum, is bringing us back so we have a clearer focus on the signal rather than the noise. And finally, Mr. Chairman, finally, and even more irrelevantly, I want to come to the title, Theorizing the Evolution of European Migration Systems. Themis. Let's not forget that Themis was the Greek goddess of order, Perhaps more important, she was a Titan, or one of the ancestors of the Greek gods, and the daughter of Uranus, the primal god, the chaos, and her union with Gaia, Earth. And I think there's a lovely image there of Earth, geography, bringing order out of chaos. Sorry, couldn't resist it.